summer of 1945 felt like the longest exhale of my life. I remember walking through what used to be the center of my hometown, the air thick with dust and the smell of burned timber. German cities had been torn open by years of bombing, yet somehow, in the ruins, people tried to behave as if normalcy could still be coaxed back into existence. Women lined up at makeshift bread stalls as though queues were a form of prayer. Children kicked dented cans between piles of shattered bricks, their laughter echoing strangely against roofless houses. By the river, women scrubbed soot-stained laundry on stones, their hands raw, their faces tired but steady. I too pretended. I told myself that if I swept the glass from what remained of our doorway, if I patched one window, if I found work hauling crates for the Americans, then maybe my life could be rebuilt plank by plank. But beneath that fragile calm, millions of us, displaced, rootless, hollowed out, waited in silence. We didn't yet understand that the ruins around us were only the beginning, that the fate of an entire future generation was being shaped quietly in those broken streets. Even then, before the world split in two, I felt something gathering beneath the surface, an inevitability no one dared to name. When the war ended, I felt as if the ground had been pulled out from beneath my feet. One moment we were shouting orders in a collapsing Reich, the next we were expected to stand still and accept a future none of us understood. Germany had risen fast and fallen even faster, leaving us in the wreckage of our own making. I remember the day the surrender was announced. Silence settled over the city like a heavy fog. Some cried, some stared blankly at the sky, and some, ashamed or angry or simply numb, walked home without a word. Then came the victors. Americans in their jeeps, Soviets in their trucks, British patrols in crisp uniforms, French officers with stern faces. They cut the country into 4 pieces, drawing borders across roads, rivers, and entire lives. I found myself in the Western Zone, where the Americans tried to smile as they checked papers and set up checkpoints. To the east, I heard the Soviets moved with a harsher discipline. Each power had its own ambitions, its own vision for what Germany should become. None of them seemed to care much about what we thought. And we Germans, what were we now? Perpetrators, victims, or something in between? I carried memories I wished I could bury, things I had seen, things I had not stopped. Others around me whispered the same questions late at night, when the fear of saying the wrong thing still clung to us like a second skin. Jewish survivors wandered through towns searching for relatives who would never return. Former prisoners of war came back gaunt and haunted, some too afraid to knock on their own doors. Freed laborers, Poles, Ukrainians, Frenchmen, marched along the roads with sacks on their backs, looking for trains that didn't exist yet. Everyone was displaced, no one knew where they belonged. In theory, peace had arrived. In reality, it felt like another kind of occupation, this time of our conscience. We pretended not to notice the tension between the eastern and western zones, but the line dividing us grew sharper every day. Rumors spread. The Soviets wanted control of all of Germany, the Americans wanted democracy at any cost, the British wanted balance, the French wanted security. And we, caught between them, tried to gather the broken pieces of our homes while avoiding the truth staring back at us. At first I tried to believe the simple promises. Rebuild your homes, they told us. Go back to work. Forget politics. Forget the past. Start over. It sounded almost comforting after years of chaos, and for a short while I let myself imagine that normal life could be pieced together like a broken cup. I cleared rubble with my bare hands, patched the roof with whatever wood I could find, and queued every morning for rations that never seemed enough. The occupation officers spoke of order, of reconstruction, of a new future that would grow from the ashes if only we kept calm and patient. But the illusion cracked almost immediately. There was no food. Not real food. The markets were empty except for a few wrinkled potatoes, and the official ration cards felt like jokes. Soon the black market replaced nearly every store in town. If you wanted bread, you needed cigarettes. If you wanted shoes, you needed luck. People traded whatever scraps they had left from their old lives, wedding rings, coats, family heirlooms, just to survive another week. Housing was even worse. Whole families crowded into one surviving room, sharing beds, blankets, and silence. Walls still smelled of smoke from the last air raid. Every night, I heard arguments drift through the ruins. Husbands who had returned from the front unable to sleep or speak, wives who had kept families alive now facing strangers they barely recognized. Some men never returned at all, and their absence hung like a question nobody could answer. I remember a neighbor who kept her husband's boots by the door for months, refusing to move them in case he found his way back. One morning they were gone. She never said whether she had put them away or finally accepted the truth. There were no clear rules anymore. Only curfews, inspections, and the uneasy feeling that the world was watching us without trusting us. The soldiers in the streets tried to enforce calm, but they could not explain how to rebuild a broken conscience. I felt as if we were expected to forget the war while still living in the heart of its ruins. By autumn, the first realization settled on all of us like cold rain. Germany could not simply turn the page. The past was not something we could bury. It kept rising from the rubble, demanding to be acknowledged, even as we tried desperately to walk forward. The winter of 1946 arrived like a slow punishment. I remember standing in line for hours, my breath hanging in the frozen air, waiting for a ladle of watery soup that never filled half the bowl. People whispered that the famine was temporary, that the next shipment would come, that spring would save us. But each week grew worse. I watched neighbors tear apart old furniture to feed their stoves. Children searched through piles of rubble for splinters of wood. More than once I woke up to find frost on the inside of my window pane, glittering like a reminder that survival was no longer guaranteed. Money meant almost nothing. The Reichsmark collapsed so completely that even the black market struggled to keep up. Sometimes cigarettes were worth more than a day's wages. Sometimes a pair of American boots could buy enough food for a week. People carried worthless bills in small sacks because wallets were too small for piles of paper no one wanted. I kept mine folded into a single envelope and used it mostly to barter for bread. It felt absurd, like living in a world where the ground was slipping away beneath my feet. Morale crumbled along with the economy. Everyone moved with a kind of exhausted determination, too tired to hope but too stubborn to give up. Fear became our quiet companion. Fear of hunger, fear of sickness, fear of being labeled the wrong kind of person in the wrong zone. Refugees drifted across the country in endless streams. Women pushing carts stacked with bedding, children clinging to bundles of clothes, wounded men limping along roads that seemed to stretch forever. They asked for directions, for shelter, for news of family members. Often I had nothing to give them but a few soft words and a place to rest for the night. At the same time, the country itself seemed to be dividing beneath our feet. In the East, the Soviets enforced their own vision of order, stern, controlled, suspicious. In the West, the Americans spoke of democracy and reconstruction, but their optimism felt distant from our daily struggle for calories and warmth. Each zone drifted further apart as if we were being pulled into two separate worlds. Some evenings, when the wind carried distant radio broadcasts, I wondered whether Germany was already becoming two countries without anyone officially admitting it. Life narrowed to essentials: heat, food, shelter, sanity. There were days when simply making it through the night felt like a victory. And yet, through all of it, the unspoken question grew louder: how much more could we endure before something inside us broke for good? In those years, humanity felt fragile, as if every person I met carried a story too heavy for their shoulders. I remember a woman who lived 2 buildings away from me. Every morning she stood by the corner with a small photograph clenched in her hand. A young man in uniform, her husband, missing since 1943. She showed the picture to anyone who passed, asking whether they had seen him in a camp or on the road home. Her voice always trembled with hope and dread in equal measure. I never had the courage to tell her what everyone else already suspected. Then there was a former prisoner of war who returned to our street in the summer of 1946. He looked older than his years, thin as a rail, his eyes shifting constantly, as though every sound reminded him of something he could not forget. He confessed to me one evening, after too many drinks, that he feared going home more than he had feared the front. "I'm not the man they remember," he whispered, "and I don't know if I can learn to be him again." His hands shook as he spoke, and I felt helpless listening to him, knowing that no one had prepared us for this kind of return. I met a Jewish survivor once, a quiet man with hollow cheeks, traveling alone with a suitcase that rattled when he walked. He asked me for directions to the station. When he thanked me, his voice cracked, as if speaking to a stranger required an effort that scraped at wounds I couldn't see. He said he was going back to his hometown, to look, not to stay. I never learned what he found there, but I remember the way he hesitated before boarding the train, as though the landscape itself might betray him. The young people, those who had been children during the war, moved differently from the rest of us. They grabbed at life with a fierceness that surprised me. Some danced in bombed-out halls where accordions played over broken tiles. Some kissed under shattered archways as if each evening might be their last. They were determined to live in a world that had tried to erase them. I envied them sometimes. Morality itself had to be reinvented. The old rules had died with the Reich, leaving us without a compass. People lied, stole, hid things, protected strangers, betrayed neighbors. Some acts were shameful, others quietly heroic. Many of us lived in the gray space between. Each day demanded choices and none were simple. I often wondered whether we were learning how to be human again, or merely pretending until it became true. By the end of the 1950s, I felt as if Germany had split not only across maps but across my own chest. The country was divided by borders first, then by systems and eventually by walls, real concrete walls topped with wire and watchtowers. I remember the morning I first saw the barricades rising in Berlin. People stood silently, stunned, some clutching bags packed for trips they would now never take. I watched families separated not by oceans or wars, but by a line drawn overnight. It felt like watching a wound close in the wrong direction. In the West, we tried to build something resembling stability. Factories reopened, new houses appeared where ruins had stood for years, and suddenly there was talk of an economic miracle. I found work again, steady work, and for the first time since the war ended, I could buy food without calculating which belongings to trade. Yet the success felt strangely hollow, as if prosperity had grown faster than our ability to understand what it meant. Meanwhile, in the East, friends and relatives lived under a different rhythm. Letters arriving less often, sentences censored, stories told in fragments. They spoke of meetings, of slogans, of expectations that pressed down on them like a permanent weight. When they visited, which became rarer with each passing year, their eyes darted in ways I recognized from older, darker times. We were the same people, yet shaped by different fears. Through all this, the past lay beneath everything like a buried minefield. The Holocaust, whispered about in the early years, could no longer be ignored. Survivors told their stories, slowly at first, then with a heaviness that made many turn their faces away. Trials began in the 1960s, forcing the country to look directly into a mirror it had avoided for too long. Watching those proceedings, I felt a sharp mix of shame, grief, and the desperate wish that we had confronted this reckoning sooner. There were no victors in that courtroom, only survivors trying to explain the unexplainable. By then, I understood something I had resisted for years. The war had never truly ended in 1945. It had continued quietly inside us, shaping our choices, our silences, our sudden moments of anger or sorrow. And when Germany finally stood divided between two ideologies, two loyalties, and two futures, it became clear that we were living in the long shadow of a past none of us had yet fully faced. As the years passed, I realized that the true aftermath of the war was not written in treaties or borders, but in the lives we carried forward. Germany changed slowly at first, then all at once, shaped by a kind of collective determination to remember and to warn. I watched as new monuments rose in places where crowds once marched in step, and as schoolchildren traced their fingers along the engraved names of victims they would never meet. It struck me that our grief had finally learned to speak, quietly, solemnly, but unmistakably. The culture of remembrance grew out of necessity, like a hand reaching for balance in the dark. We built museums where the air itself felt heavy, rooms filled with photographs that stared back at us from another lifetime. Public debates unfolded about guilt, responsibility, and the cost of silence. Sometimes those arguments tore families apart. Other times they brought long-buried truths into the open. I often wondered whether we were seeking redemption or simply trying to ensure that nothing so monstrous could ever happen again. For me, memory became a kind of duty. I visited the memorials scattered across the country, the stones embedded in sidewalks, the preserved camps, the places where walls had once divided lives. At each site, I felt a tug of something both painful and necessary. Standing before the ruins of a synagogue or the remnants of a checkpoint, I sensed the weight of lives erased, futures stolen before they had a chance to exist. The past clung to these places like a warning whispered across generations. New Germany grew cautious, thoughtful, almost wary of its own power. Political leaders spoke carefully, mindful of the history that shadowed every decision. The young grew up learning the stories we had once tried to bury, and in their eyes I saw a determination not to repeat the mistakes that had scarred their grandparents. Sometimes I envied their clarity, other times I feared the fragility of collective memory, how easily it could fade if not tended with honesty. As I grew older, one question lingered with me more than any other. Can a nation rebuild itself once it has forgotten the humanity of others? I do not know if we ever found a final answer. But I know that the silence of the past had become unbearable, and that speaking, truly speaking, was our only path forward. Perhaps remembrance is not a cure, but a promise, that we will not look away again no matter how uncomfortable the truth may be.